On October 25, 1415, French knights approached a muddy field between two woods near Agincourt, saw 6-0 starving English soldiers with long bows waiting for them, and decided to charge straight at them through knee-deep mud. If this sounds familiar, it's because their grandfathers had done the exact same thing at Cray in 1346, where 10-0 French nobles died to English arrows. The survivors of Cray had warned their sons. Those sons had warned their sons. Written accounts described in detail how charging English longbowmen was suicide. Military manuals explained why cavalry shouldn't attack prepared positions through mud. And yet here they were, 25-0. French knights about to repeat every single fatal mistake their ancestors had made. Except this time the mud would be deeper, the space tighter, and the dying even more pathetic. Every French noble at Agincourt knew about Sigh. It was the great trauma of their culture, the day French chivalry discovered that peasant archers could massacre knights. They knew about the blind King John of Bohemia charging to certain death. They knew about horses piling up in heaps. They knew about arrows darkening the sky. They had grown up hearing how the flower of French nobility was cut down like wheat. Some had fathers or grandfathers who died there. The lesson was crystal clear. Don't charge English longbow bowmen across muddy ground. Yet here was Constable Charles d'Albert, looking at almost the identical tactical situation, and his battle plan was literally advance and attack. It was as if the French nobility had collectively decided that dying the same way their ancestors did was somehow honorable. The Battle of Agincourt should never have happened. Henry V had invaded France in August 1415 with 12-0 men, besieged the port city of Harfleur for 5 weeks, and captured it at the cost of half his army to disease and combat. By October, he had maybe 6-0 men left, most of them sick, all of them exhausted. His plan was to march quickly to Killala, the English-held port, and sail home before winter. It should have been an 8-day march. Instead, French forces blocked every bridge across the Somme River, forcing Henry to march inland for weeks, searching for a crossing. His army was disintegrating from dysentery, starvation, and desertion. Men were dying in the mud every night. This was supposed to be Henry's great military adventure to claim the French throne, and it had turned into a death march. Henry V's army was dying on its feet before the battle even started. They had been marching for 3 weeks through hostile French territory, suffering from dysentery that contemporaries called the bloody flux. Most hadn't eaten properly in days. Chroniclers describe English soldiers with liquid running down their legs, too weak to control their bowels, fighting naked from the waist down because clothing was too foul to wear. Many were barefoot, their shoes rotted off in the October rain. The longbowmen were skeletal, barely able to draw their bows. Some were so sick they were vomiting while forming battle lines. The French knights, fresh and well-fed, looked at these walking corpses and laughed. They actually argued about who would get to capture King Henry, dividing up ransoms for English nobles who weren't even defeated yet. When the French army finally trapped Henry near Agincourt on October 24th, they couldn't believe their luck. English scouts reported that a French force of at least 25 men was blocking the road to Killala. The French had spent weeks assembling this army, calling in knights from across northern France, and now they had cornered the English like rats. French nobles were celebrating the night before battle, getting drunk on wine, gambling on who would capture which English lord. Some were designing the cages they would keep English prisoners in during the ransom negotiations. They discussed in detail how they would parade Henry V through Paris in chains. The Constable d'Albert had to threaten his own nobles with punishment to stop them from attacking that night. They were that confident of easy victory. To them, this wasn't a battle. It was a harvest of English gold and glory. The night before battle, the English camp was silent as a graveyard. Men were too sick and scared to talk. Some wrote letters to families they knew they would never see. Others confessed sins to priests moving through the camp. Henry V ordered complete silence. Any man who made noise would lose an ear because he didn't want the French to know how close to collapse they were. English soldiers could hear the French celebrating across the field, could see their campfires, could hear them singing and laughing. Some English archers tried to desert in the night, crawling into the woods, but French patrols caught and killed them. By dawn, the English were trapped, outnumbered at least 4-1, in a foreign country, with no hope of reinforcements. The only question was whether they would die fighting or die running. The battlefield at Agincourt was even worse than Crécy for cavalry. Recent plowing had turned the ground into thick clay that October rain had transformed into something between quicksand and glue. Field was only 1,000 wide, bordered by thick woods that prevented flanking maneuvers. It was essentially a muddy corridor of death. The English positioned themselves at the narrowest point with their long bowmen on the wings, protected by sharpened stakes driven into the ground at an angle. A new innovation since CI. The French would have to funnel into this killing zone, compressed together, unable to maneuver, walking straight into arrow range. It was so obviously a trap that some younger French knights argued they should wait, starve the English out, or find another battlefield. They were overruled by nobles who thought honor demanded immediate attack. On the morning of October 25th, French commanders held a war council that somehow managed to ignore every lesson from Sai. Marshal Bicicot, one of the few French nobles who understood modern warfare, proposed a sensible plan. Use crossbowmen to suppress English archers, send cavalry around the flanks through the woods, wait for the English to advance into the mud, then attack with fresh troops. He was shouted down by nobles who called him a coward. The Duke of Brabant said it would be dishonorable to let sick peasants set the terms of battle. The Constable d'Albert, trying to compromise, suggested they at least put their dismounted men at arms in a formation wide enough to swing weapons. He was told this showed insufficient faith in French courage. The final plan was essentially walk at them until we win. It was CI all over again, except this time they couldn't even claim ignorance. Just like at CI, the French had excellent crossbowmen, this time from Genoa and Paris, who begged to be allowed to soften up the English lines first. Just like at CI, the French nobles refused, calling it dishonorable to let commoners start the battle. The Constable d'Albert reportedly said, "French knights do not hide behind merchants. The crossbowmen were literally pushed to the back of the army. Some French nobles actually drew swords on their own. Crossbowmen who tried to move forward. The same class pride that had doomed them at Cray was about to doom them again. They had learned absolutely nothing about combined arms tactics, viewing battle as a chance for personal glory rather than coordinated warfare. It was 1346 all over again, except this time they didn't even have the excuse of surprise. When battle commenced on October 25th, St. Crispin's Day, the English looked like an army of the damned. Archers had removed their pants due to dysentery, standing half-naked in the mud. Many were bleeding from their bowels as they knocked arrows. The French knights in their gleaming armor, worth more than an English village, must have thought they were facing diseased peasants rather than soldiers. But these dying men had one advantage: they knew they couldn't run. They were too sick, too weak, too far from home. They would win or die where they stood. Henry V., only 28 years old, walked among them, promising that even the lowest born would be made gentle by fighting this day. He was sick himself, but refused to show weakness, wearing his jeweled crown over his helmet. So everyone would know where the King of England stood. The French had learned one wrong lesson from Cray. They decided the problem was not having enough men in the initial charge, so they arranged their 25-0-0 men in 3 massive battles. Divisions one behind the other with hardly any space between them. The first battle alone had 8-0-0 men at arms on foot. They had learned that much. Horses were vulnerable to arrows, but they were so tightly packed they could barely swing their weapons. The second battle was right behind them with another 8-0-0. The third had 9-0-0 more. It was like they had designed their formation specifically to maximize casualties. When the first line was pushed back, they would crash into the second line. When the second failed into the third, they had essentially created a human crushing machine with themselves as the victims. Before the main infantry advance, the French decided to send 2 cavalry wings, about 1/200 mounted knights, to ride down the English archers on the flanks. It was supposed to be a simple task: gallop through peasant archers, scatter them, wheel around, and hit the English men at arms from behind. The cavalry commanders even studied the ground the night before and reported that it was too soft for horses. They were ordered to charge anyway. As the mounted knights spurred their horses forward, the animals immediately began sinking into the mud. What should have been a thundering charge became a slow-motion stumble. Horses were pulling their hooves from the mud with each step, working as hard as if they were climbing a hill. The archers watched them coming and calmly began shooting at a speed the French had somehow forgotten was possible. The arrow storm hit the French cavalry at 200 YD, and it was crazy all over again. Horses went down, screaming, arrows in their chests and legs and faces. Knights tumbled into the mud in full armor, and those coming behind couldn't stop crashing into the fallen. Some horses, mad with pain and arrows sticking from their bodies, bucked off their riders and fled back toward French lines, causing chaos in the advancing infantry. The few cavalry who actually reached the English archers found sharpened stakes waiting. Horses impaled themselves trying to jump the barriers, throwing their riders. English archers stepped aside from the stakes and shot horses and riders at point-blank range. Within 10 minutes, both cavalry wings were destroyed, having accomplished nothing except filling the narrow battlefield with screaming horses and dismounted knights floundering in the mud. Surviving cavalry fled back toward their own lines, crashing through the first battle of infantry who were just beginning their advance. The French advance began at about 11:00 a.m., and it immediately turned into a nightmare that surpassed even Cressy. The dismounted knights, wearing up to 60 lb of armor, had to walk 300 YD through mud that came up to their knees. Each step required enormous effort, pulling their feet from sucking clay that grabbed at their sabatons, foot armor. Within 50 yards, they were exhausted. Within 100, they were gasping for breath inside their closed helmets. The neat lines dissolved as faster men outpaced slower ones. Some fell face first into the mud and couldn't get up, drowning in puddles while wearing fortunes in steel, and they hadn't even reached arrow range yet. English archers watched this slow-motion disaster approaching and couldn't believe their luck. At 250 ids, the English longbowmen began their work. Just like at Cressy, thousands of arrows darkened the October sky. But this time, the French couldn't even run forward into the storm. The mud held them in place like targets at practice. Arrows found every gap in armor, armpits when arms were raised, isolates in helmets, groins where plate metal. The French held shields over their heads, but this forced them to lean forward, making walking even harder. Knights who fell with arrow wounds couldn't get up. Their compatriots stepped on them, pushing them deeper into the mud. The English archers, despite their dysentery and starvation, were drawing and loosing with mechanical precision up to 12 arrows per minute per man. With 5,000 archers, that meant 60,000 arrows per minute falling on French knights who were barely moving forward. The French first battle kept advancing through the arrow storm because stopping meant certain death, and advancing meant possible glory. Knights with 3 or 4 arrows stuck in their armor kept walking, with arrows through their arms, still gripped their weapons. Some had arrows lodged in the eye slits of their helmets, blinded but still stumbling forward because their companions pushed from behind. The mud was turning red with French blood, and men were slipping on the bodies of those who had fallen ahead of them. By the time the first French knights reached the English lines, they had been walking for 20 minutes through knee-deep mud while being shot at continuously. They were so exhausted that some simply stopped at the English line, too tired to even raise their weapons, and waited to be killed. These were the finest knights in France, men who had trained for war since childhood, and they arrived at the fight already defeated by mud and arrows. As the French finally closed fighting range, the battlefield's narrow width created a catastrophe worse than anything at Crécy. The 8,000 men of the first battle were compressed into a front of maybe 400 YD. Men were pressed together so tightly they couldn't raise their weapons. The wings, trying to avoid the arrow storm, pushed toward the center. Knights were literally crushing each other to death before they even reached English lines. When they finally made contact with the English men-at-arms, they were so exhausted from the mud march and so compressed together that they could barely fight. The English, fresh and on solid ground they had prepared, simply had to thrust spears into the mass of French bodies pressed against them. It was less battle than industrial slaughter, exactly like Crécy, but somehow even more pathetic. Within 30 minutes of contact, the first French battle was destroyed. But instead of retreating, the second battle pushed forward into the same killing zone, climbing over the bodies of the first. Dead and wounded French knights were piling up in front of the English lines, creating literal walls of corpses 3 and 4 bodies high. The English men-at-arms used these corpse walls as defensive positions, stabbing down at Frenchmen trying to climb over their dead companions. Some French knights made it to the top of these body piles, only to be shoved backward, falling into the mass of wounded men below, who pulled them down and drowned them in mud and blood. The narrow battlefield meant there was nowhere for the French to go except forward into English weapons or backward into their own advancing troops. They were trapped in a slaughterhouse of their own making. The compression in the French ranks became so extreme that men began dying without being struck. Knights in the middle of the press couldn't move their arms, couldn't fall down, couldn't even breathe properly. They stood upright, held in place by the bodies around them, slowly suffocating inside their helmets as others pushed from behind. Some had their chest plates crushed inward by the pressure, ribs breaking, lungs collapsing. Men were dying standing up, dead on their feet, but unable to fall. When the pressure finally released, dozens of knights would collapse at once, revealing they had been dead for minutes. It was a uniquely medieval horror, being crushed to death by your own allies while wearing armor designed to protect you. The English didn't even need to kill these men. The French formation was murdering itself. In the midst of this disaster, the Duke of Alençon, one of France's greatest warriors, somehow fought his way through the chaos to reach Henry V himself. With a handful of knights, he had carved through English men-at-arms, driven by the insane courage that French nobility mistook for tactics. He actually struck Henry's crown with his sword, denting the gold, coming within inches of killing the English king. For a moment it looked like the French might snatch victory from catastrophe through sheer individual heroism. Then English guards swarmed Alençon, pulling him down, stabbing him through the gaps in his armor. He died at Henry's feet, the last French noble to come close to changing the battle's outcome. His death proved what the entire battle had demonstrated. Individual French courage was magnificent and completely useless against coordinated English tactics. As the French attack stalled and dissolved into chaos, the the English archers dropped their bows and grabbed mallets, axes, and daggers. These were peasants and men who normally would never dare approach a knight, now wading into a sea of helpless French nobility stuck in the mud. They worked methodically, smashing open helmets with mallets, driving daggers through eyelets, slitting throats of men too exhausted to resist. Some archers became incredibly wealthy in minutes, stripping rings and jeweled belts from nobles worth thousands of pounds in ransom. Knights who at the battle's start had joked about capturing Henry V were now begging English peasants for mercy, offering ransoms that would feed a village for years. The archers mostly ignored the pleas. There were too many French knights to take prisoner, and killing was easier than guarding. The French third battle, 9-0, strong and still fresh, watched this massacre from 200 yards away. They had a clear view of their companions drowning in mud, being crushed to death, clubbed down by peasant archers. They could have charged, could have tried to save their countrymen, could have at least died with honor. Instead, after 2 hours of watching the slaughter, they turned and left the battlefield. They simply walked away, leaving the first and second battles to die without help. It was the ultimate proof that French nobles cared more about their own survival than their comrades. The few knights from the first 2 battles who escaped the killing zone looked back and saw their supposed rescuers abandoning them. Some chroniclers say those survivors died of shame before they died of wounds. By mid-afternoon, the English had captured more French prisoners than they had soldiers. Hundreds of wealthy French nobles sat in groups behind English lines, guarded by just a few men. Then scouts reported that the French third battle might be regrouping for another attack. Henry V faced a brutal calculation. If the French attacked again, the prisoners would be freed and would fight from behind English lines. The English would be surrounded and destroyed. So Henry gave an order that stained his victory: kill all the prisoners. English men at arms refused at first, murdering unarmed nobles who had surrendered, violated every law of chivalry, and cost them fortunes in ransom. So Henry ordered his archers to do it. These peasants, who had just become rich beyond dreams, were forced to murder their wealth. They herded French nobles into barns and set them on fire. They clubbed men who had surrendered in good faith. Over 1,000 French prisoners were massacred in cold blood, turning a military victory into a war crime. When the killing finally stopped around 400 p.m., the battlefield looked like a vision of hell. French bodies were piled so high in some places that they blocked the view across the field. English heralds counted between 7,000 and 10,000 French dead, including most of France's military leadership. 3 dukes, 90 counts and barons, 1,500 knights. The entire military aristocracy of France lay dead in the mud. English lost fewer than 500 men, most of them in the initial arrow exchange. It was a massacre ratio even worse than Cray, a complete vindication of English longbow, tactics, and absolute proof that French nobles had learned nothing in 70 years. The battlefield was so choked with corpses that locals spent 3 days burning bodies, and the smell carried for miles. The worst part of Agincourt wasn't the death count or the tactical disaster. It was the fact that French nobility had every opportunity to avoid it and chose glory over survival anyway. They had 70 years of warnings. They had written accounts of Sai. They had the numerical advantage, better equipment, fresh troops against dying enemies. All they had to do was nothing. Wait out the English, let starvation finish Henry's army, or force battle on better ground. Instead, they charged into the same trap their grandfathers had died in, made the same mistakes, ignored the same advice, and died in the same mud. It proved that French military culture valued personal honor over victory, individual glory over collective success, and dying nobly over winning intelligently. And incredibly, the French nobility still hadn't learned their lesson. They would lose battles the same way for another 100 years until Joan of Arc finally taught them that peasants with weapons could actually win wars if you let them fight smart instead of making them die prettily.